you finally have the verdict that came out regarding who killed the former Lebanese Prime Minister, Hariri. Now, for the longest time, and I'm telling you, this happened in 2005. The whole time since 2005, you had the whole world and a lot of people in Lebanon, actually, who kept blaming Syria for this, right? They said that, oh, Syria assassinated Hariri because of disagreements, rivalry. I mean, this never made sense whatsoever. It never made any sense. But the UN came out with a report saying, oh, yeah, Bashar al-Assad did it for sure. And the whole world was blaming Syria for that. You never hear the end of it. Now, what ended up happening is the UN, they set up a special tribunal inside of Lebanon. So this was a very complex thing because it was based off of Lebanese law, but it was being run by the UN essentially and supposed to be, very transparent and all this stuff. Ended up costing $1 billion. Okay. I mean, this is not, it's not some cheap gig, man. They spent $1 billion on this trial. So the verdict finally comes out and surprise, surprise, there's nothing to do with Syria. There's nothing to do with Hezbollah. So they put 4 people on trial. And these were members of Hezbollah. Keep in mind, these were all put on trial in absentia. No one was actually there. One of them is dead, and Hezbollah wasn't going to give up the other 3 to actually go to the Netherlands, right? So the decision comes out, the verdict comes out. They found one of these guys guilty based off of network data, his telephone. They say that, oh, this telephone that was used in the attack, he definitely had it in his possession. That's their rationale. But they say that this guy acted alone, and it has nothing to do with the leadership of Hezbollah. It has nothing to do with Nasrallah, okay? So, once again, all this shit we've been hearing for 15 years, that Syria did it for sure, and it was totally Hezbollah with Syria. They plotted to get rid of Hariri. No evidence for that whatsoever. And it never made any sense anyway, because you know what happened? You know what resulted out of Hariri's assassination? Well, I mean, a huge car bomb. You got 2 dozen people killed and enormous political turmoil. And the Syrian army had to pull out of Lebanon. That was the big change. That was the largest consequence of his assassination. The Syrian army had to pull out of Lebanon. So once again, you got to ask yourself now, well, hold on a second. Why would Syria assassinate Hariri just so they get kicked out of Lebanon? What? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, I don't think they should have been there in the first place, but you got to understand at the same time that they're acting as a buffer against Israel. And surely enough, 1 year later, Israel invades Lebanon because there's no Syrian army. So they felt emboldened and, they invaded in July 2006, and this war lasted like 34 days until August 14th. So again, that never made any sense. And you got to look at the MO. You got to look at the modus operandi. Dude, there's one actor in that whole region that is specialized in assassinations, especially car bombs. Okay? It's Israel. And it's the same actor. They're the only people that benefited from the whole thing. They benefited from the resulting political turmoil, all this instability in Lebanon. You also had talks, sort of a rapprochement, right? Between Shia and Sunni inside of Lebanon that was going behind the scenes. And that completely destroyed that and led to more tension between the two, led to Syria being kicked out of Lebanon, the whole army pulling out. Israel is the only actor that benefited from this assassination. And like I said, this is their MO. They've done over 500 assassinations that we know of, with 1,000 deaths from that. So for like every person they kill, there's one innocent person dying. Pretty shitty ratio, if you ask me. But on top of that, Syria and Hezbollah don't operate like this. They don't typically go around killing or assassinating rivals. I mean, say what you will, like you don't have to like them, but just based off of history, based off what we know, that's not how they work. That's not what they do. They don't assassinate people, especially not fucking heads of state. I mean, you got to remember this guy's the prime minister of Lebanon, of the country next door. No, this is ridiculous. Nah. So we also had people in the U.S. Congress talking about documents that they'd seen in 2016 showing that Israel did the assassination. But nonetheless, I mean, just the fact that this verdict came out, it's a big thing. It's very huge. And keep in mind, when the explosion in Beirut happened just 2 weeks ago, people thought that Hezbollah did it. It's like this wild conspiracy theory, like, oh, they're afraid of the verdict coming out. That's why they did this huge explosion, to distract everyone. Just bullshit. And like I said, I mean, they delayed the announcement of the verdict regardless. So it wasn't announced that week because of the explosion. There was just so much going on that they left it till this week. So here's the official statement. So the tribunal exonerated the leadership of Hezbollah in Syria, citing a lack of evidence. Quote, the trial chamber is of the view that Syria and Hezbollah may have had motives to eliminate Mr. Hariri and some of his political allies. However, there was no evidence Hezbollah's leadership had any involvement in Mr. Hariri's murder, and there's no direct evidence of Syrian involvement in it. Now look, man, if you spend $1 billion on a trial, $1 billion, and you can't come up with evidence, well, I'm pretty sure that fucking evidence doesn't exist, because you still got people complaining. They're like, oh, it's there, they just didn't look hard enough. No. Dude, trust me, if they wanted to find that shit, they would have found it. They'd love to nail this on Hezbollah's leadership and Syrian government. They'd love to, but they can't. They were blaming Syria for 15 years, but there's no evidence of that. And I don't even agree with that statement that they have motives. What motives? They lost the most from this situation, and where the Syrian army had to pull out. They were essentially humiliated and chastised for this. So no, I don't understand what they would have benefited from that at all whatsoever. Following the tribunal's decision, Lebanon is meant to hand over Ayash, but the government, where Hezbollah and its allies hold political power, is not expected to do so. The group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has repeatedly said he would not hand over any member of the movement, insisting last week on the innocence of the suspects and describing the tribunal as a conspiracy against the group. So, on the one hand, as we noted, they're not indicting or saying the leadership had anything to do with it. But nonetheless, you know, the United States, Israel, they're looking at this and saying, oh, you see, we welcome this decision, and clearly Hezbollah are guilty. I just wanted to bring you up to date on that. Because, man, after this, I mean, you know, it really changed Lebanon. That was, once again, an event that really altered the course of Lebanon's history. Because, as I said, this rapprochement that you had going on behind the scenes was broken. You had a huge split, enormous political turmoil. Syria was removed. No more buffer between Lebanon and Israel. And as I said, the following year, Israel invaded and killed 2,000 Lebanese, destroyed their infrastructure, set them back a couple of years. I mean, yeah, as I said here, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the United States welcomed the conviction. Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure he would. He definitely would.